Okay, it's really, really great to be here. We've all gone through this mad thing over the last number of years on Zoom and being in our houses and connecting through technology and so on, and it's really great to be back in the real world and seeing old friends and old faces and making new friends over the last couple of days. Anyway, great to be here, Nuala, great to sort of talk to you, particularly around this novel, Nora. But we'll come to that, but I just to sort of go back to some of your other work, or when you began to think that you were a writer, because we've got a lot of writers here and they want to know the secrets, as it were. But when did you think that this is what you wanted to do?
I suppose I was one of those kids who always said I wanted to be a writer, and I came second in a national poetry competition when I was 9 with a poem in Irish about travellers, and the judge was Michael Hartnett. And I remember going to the awards ceremony in RTE. We were recorded and then we were brought for dinner in Montrose. It was all very posh. And my mother was with me, and I remember her reverence around Hartnett, and I remember sort of clocking how important he seemed as a person and as a figure, and he was incredibly nice. My teacher, I had a great teacher. I went to a Gael school in Dublin City Centre, and that teacher was very cultural in Rangatree, 3rd class, and she encouraged my writing, and my mother encouraged my reading, and I was always writing really as a kid and as a teenager. I remember my dad saying to me when I was about 15, "Oh, you don't write anymore." I said, "I do, Dad, just don't show it to you anymore." Because I was writing about, teenage angst and love and whatever else. But really, I moved to Galway when I was 25 to take up a job in a theatre company there, Punchbag Theatre, and 2 of the other staff were writers. And one was Rosita Boland and the other was Fred Johnston. And I was muttering to them that I was writing secretly, kind of. And Fred said, "Why are you doing it in secret? Sure, why don't you join a group?" So I did. I went to a workshop with Mike McCormack, who's well known now, and with Louis Dupuer, one fiction writer, one poet. And it was the right time. I was 28. I had been writing in secret for years. I didn't think I could be a writer. I didn't know working class kids could be writers. I had no writer friends. I had no knowledge of how you became a writer. It turns out you just keep writing and try and find some writer pals and join a group. And it hadn't occurred to me to join a group. I don't know why. I'm not really a group person, I suppose. And just from there, I wrote enough poems to send to publishers, and there was a local feminist press, still is, Ireland House in Galway, and I sent them the poems, and my first book was a poetry collection that came out in a book with 2 other poets. You know the way they do these triple anthology type things. And one of them was Deirdre Brennan and the other was Mairead Maeve, 2 fabulous women writers who were a couple of, maybe 10, 20, 30 years older than me. So I was the newbie. And then Alan published short story collections from me the following year. I found, while I loved poetry, I adored fiction. So fiction became my thing, really.
Yeah. That was my second question as to, the move from poetry to fiction. Do you still write poetry, or is it not a part of your practice?
The very odd time. I wish I wrote more. It's a case of they're not occurring to me, and I think, in a sense, flash fiction is filling the poetry void for me, in the sense that I'm very much a languagey writer, and so my flash fiction is very languagey, and they're almost more like prose poems than anything else, a lot of the time. Yeah. They're not very narrative-y, they're more sort of prosy.
Is there a sense in which being a poet, you have to work in a different way or think in a different way? Like the attention to language, the conciseness of poetry as opposed to the expansiveness of fiction. Do you find that a kind of interesting difference?
Yeah, I suppose it's the distillation in poetry, but I'm more naturally, in a sense, a short story writer. So the business of concision and precision and, getting the thing to its essence in a way comes more naturally to me than the expansive form of the novel. So you'll notice all of the chapters are very short, because initially I had conceived of this novel as a novella in flash fiction, which obviously it did not become a novella. I have an ambition to write a novella. It hasn't happened yet because I keep taking on very large subjects that just sort of get very overblown. But I think my apprenticeship, if you want to call it that, as a poet, has only served me well as a fiction writer. In fact, a lot of the time my editors will say, can you expand that out? I find especially the American editors are very interested in a way, spoon-feeding the reader.
All right.
Whereas I find Irish editors are a little more inclined to let you do your thing and to let the actions of the characters speak for themselves without a huge thought process going on as to why they're doing it.
Right.
So sometimes I'm asked to expand things out rather than keep with my very natural concision.
Right, okay. Yeah. And just one more question, I suppose, going back to childhood and maybe starting out, the Irish language, obviously you went to a Gael school and so on. You've written in the Irish language. Is there any tensions there between the Anglo and the Irish, the English and the Irish languages?
I definitely think growing up between two languages has benefited me hugely. So my school day, right the way up to my MA, was as Gaeilge. I did my degree in Irish as well. And then my home life was in English with a very pro-Irish sort of flavour from my father. He was a kind of an armchair Republican, you know. I think I did a master's in translation in DCU because I just adored translating people's work. And I think that attention to language has stood me in good stead. And I'm very wedded to Hiberno English as well, which is why I love writing about Irish characters. Again, this is something sometimes that the American editors struggle with slightly. They don't understand our language. I have a new editor for this book, and she was much more accepting of my phraseology, my weird Irish syntax, all of those things that sometimes there's a sort of a homogenizing of language that they want to happen, but she was wonderful. She totally accepted Nora's voice as it was. She would query the odd phrase that she'd never heard of, but then if I sort of could prove that it existed, she'd say, that's grand, you know. And I see a lot of actually fellow writer friends who are published in the States coming up against the same thing.
Right.
A sort of can we dilute the language a bit so that people understand? Like really kind of in a way, I feel, mistrusting readers.
Yeah, yeah.
Because I think readers are very willing to do a bit of work, especially readers of literary fiction and short fiction and things where there is a little bit of work to be done. Yeah. I think that we have to trust our readers. They talk about this so-called book club reader as if they're some kind of generic individual who only likes certain books, which is absolute rubbish. I mean, I have run book clubs. I'm in a book club now. Granted, we only read Elizabeth Bowen, but you know what I mean. You know, book club readers are astonishingly erudite in their own way and are very open to all sorts of weirdness. And like if I read a book set in New Zealand, I want it to sound like it's set in New Zealand. I don't want it to sound like some blando English that we can all so-called understand.
Yeah. And certainly a lot of Irish writing, Roddy Doyle was here yesterday again, the energy of a lot of his fiction comes from that Hiberno English or Dublinese, you know. But yeah, that's kind of, I mean, it's always of interest to me, those who move between different genres, so working in poetry, translation into fiction, or even then, you know, doing screenplays or in drama, that each of these modes demands something different from you as a writer, because each mode allows you to do something that the other modes might not. And that kind of crossover, I think, or the possibility of that, is kind of interesting. But to come to Nora, I mean, just looking at some of the work that you've done, Miss Emily, Becoming Belle, historical fiction, I suppose, for want of a better term. What attracts you to that as a thing to write about, or as a kind of fiction?
I suppose I would have written a lot of historical fiction short stories based on various women, people like Assia Wevel, who was the woman who Ted Hughes left Sylvia Plath for. I wrote a story about her. I've written a story about the American poet Elizabeth Bishop, the Mexican artist Frida Kahlo. So I have this kind of pantheon of maverick women that I'm interested in. And I've been writing about them for a long time, and then finally decided to take on Emily Dickinson. I had tried writing a novel about a German artist, Paula Modersohn-Becker, and I worked myself into knots. I spent 2 years doing this book. I went back and forth to Germany, to Paris, where she had lived, and the whole thing collapsed under the weight of the research, I think. I knew too much, in a sense. So I kind of learned from that I needed to remind myself, in a sense, that I was a fiction writer. So even though you're using a real person, you are wedding fact and fiction. The late, great Hilary Mantel said that it's impossible to separate fact from fiction in these kinds of works. It's like trying to separate mayonnaise, she said, you know, the egg yolk from the oil. She's one of my literary heroines. I'm very sad she's dead. But I think I like these women who go against society and who, in whatever way, thrive. You could say Emily Dickinson thrived in the sense that she produced a body of work. She didn't share it. You know, it was really she only got famous after she died. But she achieved what she wanted for her life. So I was interested in that as an introvert. And then Belle Bilton married into the local aristocracy where I live in Galway. And I was just, because I'm a blow-in in Ballinasloe, I was wondering what was it like for this music hall girl from London who was used to the West End, the London stage, and she comes to a sleepy market town in the middle of Ireland. What was that like? And I think that's where all of these things start off for me. What was it like? So when I came to Nora, and she seemed like a very natural fit for me as a dub in Galway. I was about 22 years in Galway when I started writing this. I was studying Italian by night in NUI Galway, and I had to write an essay about Joyce's time in Trieste and his friendship with Italo Svevo. And I started the research. I took out my old copy of Brenda Maddox's Nora, biography of Nora, and I just became much more interested in what Nora was doing than in writing my essay about Joyce. And I started just thinking, what did she feel about being married to this man, a known drinker, someone who was feckless with money, who made her move house all the time? What was it like to be unmarried when you wanted to be married, to have 2 children out of wedlock, knowing you could probably never come back to Ireland and hold your head high without lying into people's faces? You know, so I start these processes, and it's like the giddy juice starts flowing in me, and I think, oh, could this be my next thing? Am I going to be with this for a few years now? Yeah. I wrote a short story first about Nora and James, just from the day they first walked out, 16th of June 1904, to when they got on the boat the following 8th of October to go to Europe together. Very short courtship relationship, and off they go, unmarried. And the story did well. It was published and granted, won a prize. But I just felt I'm not finished with her. I need to know how she felt about the bulk of it, the years in Trieste, the years in Paris, all of that. So I read Ellman, the brilliant biography of Joyce. I reread my Maddox. I went and I bought Stanislaus's books and the biography of their father. I bought Porrick Colum's book about their friendship. I read up on all, like Budgeon, I read his book about their friendship. So I read around the subject hugely, read the letters. And all the time I was doing that, I just kept writing. So I was drip feeding the information to myself and writing. Again, Mantel said that the writer of these kind of fictions lives inside the consciousness of the characters for whom the future is blank. Yeah. So you have to pretend you know nothing. Yeah. You might know the trajectory of Joyce and Nora's story, but as the fiction writer, you have to sit there and just write in media res as if you are Nora and you don't know that your poor daughter is going to end up institutionalized for most of her life. You don't know that your son is going to marry a woman older than him who turns out to have very bad mental health problems. You don't know any of this, and so you're just a mammy with children with a fella who's a bit of a handful. And
that's one way of putting it.
One way of putting it. You're trying to get on with your life. Nora was lucky. Well, of course, Joyce was lucky. He got Nora, but she was lucky in herself to be a very naturally confident, charismatic, stout-hearted woman who could deal with a nervy, sensitive individual like Joyce. So they were a good sort of yin and yang of each other.
Yeah. I think, for me, one aspect of historical fiction, or Nora, so when I read this, I had no expectations of what it would be about and so on, of course. So I'm an academic, and I was thinking, there's not enough about Joyce and writing here, right? But then I realised, of course, but it isn't about Joyce, you know. He's obviously a character, very important, but this is about Nora. But yet, I actually think the best kind of fiction in this way humanises these characters that we think we already know. Or we get to see Joyce from a different angle, you know, from a very not a homely, that's not, but, you know, more intimate, let us say, as opposed to the public figure or the writerly figure. And in that way, I thought that was really interesting, because in some ways it brought me back to Ulysses, and sort of, you know, you understand some of the impulses, let us say, behind his writing fiction. So in terms of Nora as a character, the idea, you did it in reverse. She left Galway to come to Dublin. You leave Dublin to go to Galway. And you've talked about what sort of attracted you to her initially. Did you find that your writing of her, I suppose, did you see her develop from that sort of 1904 or earlier character into something different?
Absolutely, yeah. Just to your other point, Joyce didn't like the public life of the writer. He didn't like it, and I think he probably drank a lot to cope with that, because he was sort of a nervous individual. Yeah, I mean, she, unlike Joyce, when they met at 20 years of age, she was 20, he was 22, she had 7 years of work experience under her belt. She had lived away from her family with her grandmother, down the road, but she was brought up essentially as an only child with her granny and her uncle. She'd some small experience of boys. She had had 3 boyfriends, 2 of whom had died very sadly, one of TB and the other one, can't remember. So she was sort of more able for the world. She had a job when they met in Finn's Hotel. She was a sort of a maid of all work. She did a lot of work around the place, and she lived in the hotel. So she had run away. Her uncle had beat her for going out with a Protestant boy, so she ran away from Galway. Said, right, that's enough of that, I'm off. Got a job really quickly, went to an agency and got a job in Finn's. He, meanwhile, is grieving the loss of his mother, who's died the previous August. This is June. He doesn't have a job. He's a failed medical student. He's been to Paris for a little while. Didn't really knuckle down to his studies, was more interested in other things in Paris, and didn't want to live with his family because he resented his father's drinking, the fact there was no money for food, and so was couch surfing essentially, friend to friend. As we know, he ended up in the Martello Tower and all of that. So she was in a much stronger position as an individual. They both had great confidence, I'd have to say, but for different reasons. Joyce was educated, as we know. Nora was not. She left school at 12, the way most working class people did. They just about managed to get Joyce through school, the Joyces. Stanley didn't get to go to Clongowes Wood, you know. So they were from different sort of social strata, but they were both confident young people with a great love of music from port towns. Both loved storytelling and could talk for Ireland. So while there wasn't a meeting of intellects, there was certainly a meeting of bodies and minds and sensuality. And, you know, Joyce must have been delighted when she walked into his life. Not just her beautiful name.
Yeah.
You know, he loved Ibsen's Nora. Then he hears Barnacle. He must have been thrilled. And then he finds out she has a mouthful of stories.
Yeah. And
he can use these stories in his already rather wonderful work. He was already writing Dubliners, you know, as a very young man. It's astonishing to think of this under 25-year-old producing these insightful, deep, emotional stories. And she was there for essentially most of that. Yeah. And I think that's what comes across, the way you present Joyce here, which I think is true, you know, his sense of pride, but also his kind of holding of grudges. Yes. You know, and really almost pathological kind of hatred for people and conspiracy theories, they're all out to get me and so on. And the way that Nora kind of interacts with that and tries to sort of deal with that and
move them on, as it
Yes,
were,
yeah.
from it. In terms of, I mean, you said that they're short chapters, and that was one thing I noticed, obviously, when you're beginning it, that each chapter in many ways exists in and of itself.
Yeah.
It has its own shape or rhythm. I mean, how do you find that as a writer to, you've got a longer chapter, then a shorter chapter, a rhythm that seems to sort of rush because that's what's happening in terms of the story being told, or something that's a little bit more reflective. Is that something that comes in the second draft or the third draft, or is that the way you're thinking as you're writing?
Yeah, it's the way I'm thinking. Like, I did want them sort of discreet at the start, and then I just tossed out that idea and just kept going, These things tend to evolve as you do them.
Yeah.
And obviously a life is not a plot, and so you're trying to pick the episodes from the life that best reflect. There was a lot more in this, and my editor took bits out. So I had the bit where, when they were in Zurich, Jim set up a thing called the English Players and put her in the play, and she was coaching it was a sing play, coaching all the other actors with their Galway accents and stuff, and the children played extras. So this lovely family thing of them being in the play. And I thought it was a great scene, but apparently it wasn't moving things along fast enough, so that was ditched. And then various other things were ditched. Interestingly, 2 scenes that I had of Nora on her own, fully with her own agency, doing her own thing, that were taken out. My editor took them out. And I was at a book club recently, and someone said, she had no agency, she was never on her own. It was like, actually she was, but I wasn't allowed to include that.
Yeah.
Because obviously the editor is trying to sell it in terms of James Joyce, and so the more that he's there as a continuous thread, the better for the editors and the sales and marketing team.
Oh, right, okay. There you go, things you don't have to think about when you're sort of writing, as it were.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that is interesting that obviously you're focusing in on particular moments, particular years or events, and there's gaps necessarily so in that. I mean, do you plot that out at the beginning? Do you think, look, we have to use this scene, there's got to be the Paris moment, or there's got to be, this, that, and the other? I mean, are they kind of staging points in terms of developing the story? Or
Yeah. I think that's a good way of thinking of it. So I still have this modus operandi of doing my research in tandem with my writing. So I'm writing something new at the moment. And what I do is I read biography or whatever is available, and I pencil it. So I do this at night, and then the next morning I go through that and take notes. And so things that stand out to you then are the things probably that might end up in the book, if they're useful. Even a phrase or something, or an insight into the person's personality. So I keep a personality sheet as well. And I didn't realise maybe that the Lucia piece would have bloomed so large in the novel, but then it had to, because Nora was essentially her carer, so she was with Lucia a lot while Jim was drinking or writing. So I had to tease that out, and I had found other people had been very unkind to Nora, blaming her essentially for Lucia's illness, which I found no evidence for in any of my research, but people... You're working with a lens, your own particular and personal lens, when you write a book like this. And so I come at it as a mother, I come at it as someone who's empathic, I come at it, wondering what it's like to have a daughter with a mental illness, and how do you deal with that when treatments are just not good, and,
Or nobody even knows what the issue is. There's no language for it there.
Exactly. I mean, she was diagnosed as a hebephrenic schizophrenic. She had several different issues and things that she did. Who knows what was actually wrong with her? I have theories, but I'm not going to float them. Theories about her and her father, but you don't want to say things, because people have a habit of saying very definite things that there's no actual evidence for, so we can't really be definite. So you're coming at this, you're coming at the research with a filter, and then you filter that filter, and then you have a view and a particular and personal lens that you're using yourself. So there's whatever you'd say, there's a trail of factual crumbs, and then you're building something around that.
Yeah.
It's incredibly enjoyable as a process, for me anyway, because I love research. And I think that's maybe why I have continued writing these, though I keep saying I'm going to stop. I don't.
Joyce himself always said that say what Ulysses, the Homeric scaffolding, each episode corresponding to an episode in Homer's The Odyssey. But that once he'd written the novel, he could burn down the bridges, as it were. And that also, even though that he had that scaffolding in mind, he was always chasing that moment of magic, the stuff that you just wouldn't expect, and he'll go with that. But just listen to you talk there. For me, certain characters emerge within the novel. Lucia, obviously, becomes really central. Wonderful. I'll read a little bit. This favourite passage, actually. I'll read it now because I think I just thought it was wonderful. It just caught me. The sense of, this is when Lucia is dancing. When she dances like this, our little troubled Lucia disappears and my daughter becomes her best, fullest self. All her awkward pieces fall away and she flows and glides easy as a river. And it's that idea that in that moment, all her trials and tribulations, all the illnesses, as it were, just fade away and she is who she is, essentially so. And then Stanislaus is another character that emerges as a kind of hero, actually and he was a long-suffering hero, in fairness, in life, I think, as well. I mean, as he calls it, one of the books he wrote was My Brother's Keeper, and by God was he, really, in so many ways. But he emerges as an interesting character in and of himself. Was that something you discovered as you were writing, is what I'm asking, I suppose? Were they one of the happy kind of moments of magic? Oh my goodness, this is a great character.
Absolutely, yeah. I sort of fell in love with Stanny. He was, again, the sort of opposite of Jim. He was a sober, literally didn't drink, non-smoking, hard-working, serious individual. And Jim was the all-drinking, all-dancing, collapsing on the floor, singing his head off. Messer kind of loved humour, silly humour and whatever. But Stanny was his sounding board, but he also knew what he was, that he was always going to be second best. He said, Jim uses me as a butcher uses its steel, which is some comment about your brother. And he did use him. He brought him over in the great Irish emigrant tradition to fatten up the coffers, essentially, in the house in Trieste. When you read, Stanny was on the side of the irredentists around the time of World War I, and he ended up arrested and imprisoned in Katzenau. So he spent the war years, World War I years in prison. So Nora sent him care packages. And when you read the letters between them and what was in the packages, it's all very flirty. So that was why I warmed up. And there is a tradition in Irish literature of the two brothers, the one woman sort of, that triangle, which I liked to play with there. She was an extraordinarily attractive woman. Stanny was a handsome, sober, serious. Sometimes I'm sure she looked at him and thought, I think I married the wrong
brother.
Because this fellow would have done right by me. And Stanny put a lot of his own life on hold in order to prop up the Joyce family, Jim, Nora and the kids. Married late, married at 40, married an 18-year-old student of his, and then named his child James Joyce, And weirdly died on Bloomsday, the 16th of June. So all these funny little things that happened. But I warmed up the relationship between Stanny and Nora in the book. There's a sort of a slight, little, tiny, intimate moment between them, which I invented. But I'm allowed to do that. I'm a fiction writer.
But yes, I mean, because when I was reading it, I was thinking, I don't remember this from the Maddox. I don't remember this from Elman or whatever. But in terms of the world of the novel, it's utterly believable because of the intensity, literally, of that situation in Trieste that they're all in. It's hot and it's small. There's drinking, there's work. You know what I mean? It's survival at some level. So you could see how something like that could happen, as it were. But yeah, Stanislaus, I mean, Joyce himself said, a brother is as easy to forget as an umbrella, which I think is
very cruel.
Very.
And also when Jim went home to Dublin, and he wasn't appreciated in Ireland. So when he was invited to the Gresham one night, and they were sort of lauding him to his face, it went straight to his head, of course. And when he came back to Trieste, Danny said, "Oh, did anyone ask for me?" And he said, "Oh yeah, loads of people, but I can't remember what they said." And that was the kind of thing he'd say. He was often mean-spirited at times.
I know.
He left Stanny. I had another scene. Their brother-in-law committed suicide. And I had a whole scene in where Jim left it to Stanny to tell their sister, even though he had opportunity. You know, so he really, I always think Stanny got the shitty end of the joystick. But I love him, and if you look at photographs of Stanny, he was very handsome.
Yeah.
So when he was in prison, he had a picture of Nora up on his bed. You know, his area that he slept in or whatever. It wasn't a terrible imprisonment. They were putting on plays and stuff, so they were grand. And she was sending him boxes of cigarettes to sell, biscuits, cocoa, stuff like that. So it wasn't like a very bad situation.
Yeah.
But the guard said, "Is that your wife, Joyce?" And Stanny said, "Yes." Told a lie. And the guard said, "Oh, she's lovely." So he was telling Nora this in a letter. And he said, the guard said, "Is that Mrs. Joyce, I think?" And he said, "Yes." So he said, "I didn't actually tell a lie."
Yeah.
So these kind of very flirty letters between them. They had a great brother-in-law, sister-in-law love, but I like to think it was a little warmer, maybe.
And then, obviously, Lucia, as a character, plays a very central role as the novel progresses. I mean, from when they were kids, herself and Giorgio, and then as they're sort of young adults, I mean, obviously it changes, of course, the relationship. And I thought it was brilliantly drawn, just how this sort of creeps up on her, this illness, this awkwardness, this strangeness, just the difficulty, and literally the difficulty of living with this. I mean, how do you cope with this?
It must have been frightening for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, violence and running away and for weeks, days, money, all of those kind of
promiscuity.
Yeah. Poor
going
Beckett.
Out in she had a mad crush on Beckett and went after him, and he was having none of it. He liked her, but he didn't love her.
Yeah.
And then they arranged a date, and he brought a third wheel, and she was going bananas. And oh Lord, But it was Giorgio who incarcerated her first. Nora always gets the blame.
Yeah.
Giorgio brought her away to an asylum that night that she threw the chair at Nora.
Yeah.
So I think the narrative against Nora has been very poor on this. All the evidence I find is that she did everything she could for Lucia, but knew she was ill and knew she needed help. Joyce was blind to it. No, she's just artistic. She's more like me, whatever. That's grand, but I'm the one who has to mind her, Nora said, and she's hitting me, and sometimes she felt she was just looking for attention, which she probably was. Nora and Jim were very tight. They were one of those couples who only have eyes for each other. Very Irish in that Giorgio was a mamone, as they say in Italy. He was a mammy's boy. Lucia was daddy's girl. So there was that split. And like all the moving around, they're moving school, they're moving friend group, they're moving house. They've no roots, these kids. They've no skills as such other than their artistic skills, which neither of them found they could carry forward to a career. Giorgio, having disdained drink as a younger man, became his father. Didn't eat, just drank. No career. So I don't like to blame Nora and Jim directly for this. Lucia was ill, but Giorgio was an adult. He could have taken himself in hand, and he didn't. So, Elman said Joyce throve on flurry, and Stanny said Jim lives on the excitement of events. And I think what Jim wanted, Jim got. And if he wanted to move to Paris, that's what was happening. And Nora was madly loyal, shall we say, and went along with him. Though she did complain, it's not like she wasn't saying,
"This is awful.
Yeah. I'm leaving you, I'm getting those kids baptised, I'm going back to Ireland to show everyone you can't keep us,
I thought that was really well drawn. I mean, the idea that he wouldn't marry her just out of, again, for an intellectual idea, as it were.
Yes, principles.
Principles. What did principles ever get us as in the Sean O'Casey play? But I mean, and the way she rails against that, wants to make it proper in her eyes and so on, but also at some level for herself, she's like, it doesn't matter. Do you know what I mean? Like in the grand scheme of things, for us to do this, for your principles, it won't matter. But he had those. Eventually, they did get married, of course. I think Where do you think she was happiest? Trieste, Paris?
I'd say if they were going to stand and look back, they'd say Trieste. It was their formation. It was where they became a family. You know, Italian became the language of the family, and that's where she learned Italian. She had nice settled periods in Paris, though. She had 2 stints of, I think, 3 years in one apartment, and I think 5 or 6 in another. And all she wanted all the time was a home. She wanted to entertain. She loved to cook. You know, they loved to have a piano. No matter how poor they were, they hired a piano and they sang. She wanted that. She wanted to be sort of proper. And they were quite square in their own weird way.
Yeah.
You know, they were what we would consider bohemian, but they frowned on bohemia. They were mixing with the lost generation in Paris, you know, your Guggenheims and your Hemingways. And they were appalled at how these young people carried on, talking about their bodies and being very free and open. There was a lot of wife swapping that went on, husband swapping. And they were like, this is horrendous.
I think people forget that Joyce himself, like he was of his time, he was very Victorian, I suppose.
Was, yeah.
You know, in his morals. And
people used to slag off their decor in their apartment because it was so Victorian looking.
Yeah.
They weren't modern at all. The great modernist writer was in fact quite bourgeois in his sort of, you know, brocade tablecloths.
Yeah.
And he was kind of, he wanted to be a gentleman.
Yeah.
And a gentleman needs money, and so that's why he had to find sponsors, and all these wonderful women like Harriet Weaver and Sylvia Beach stepped in magnificently and enabled the whole Joyce project. His father was the same. His father wanted to be a gentleman, but managed to just drink away all the money.
Yeah, I think like if characters come out like Lucia or Stanislaus, the other constant in the novel is money, the lack of it, the want of it. The spending of it. That was Joyce's life and Nora's life.
They weren't good money managers, either of them. Like, even when they left Ireland, she had no money, having worked for 6 months or whatever in the hotel. I don't know what she was spending it on. Yeah, he was a great man for getting other people to do things for him, including funding his life. And Harriet Weaver, the English editor and publisher, gifted the equivalent of 1.5 million euro to the family in today's money over the course of her gifting. She would inherit money from her grandfather and hand it straight to Joyce. Interestingly, colonial money, her grandfather was a cotton merchant or something, okay. Which I always think is quite amusing. That Joyce's drinking was on the back of colonial slavery. Oh God, it's terrible. But anyway, and then, of course, he's in mithering on to Sylvia Beach that nobody will publish Ulysses as a book. You know, and he knows her partner, Adrienne, is publishing books in French. So he's fishing.
Yeah.
And she said, oh, Joyce, would you do me the honour of letting me publish your book? And he bit her hand off.
Yeah.
And this mad contract was drawn up that wasn't ever really signed. But he was to get, I think it was 60% of the royalties. You know, everything in his favour.
Yeah.
Everything. And she produced this astonishing £3.5, 750-page book that she does in a limited edition of 1,000 and sells to rich people, essentially.
Yeah.
And he benefited hugely from that. And then, you know, Kevin Birmingham, in his book about the scandal around Ulysses and the trial and all of that, says that Shakespeare & Co. was a thinly monetised social centre, which I love. They used the till as a petty cash box, the Joyces. Like, Joyce would send Lucia down to take money out of the till against royalties. Beach earned nothing off this book. Nothing.
I mean, it really, it's wonderful in the sense when money comes in, they go off and have a wonderful meal, and they both enjoy it, you know, and they really, the sense is, Nora's, this is great. I love champagne. I love
having a milliner.
Yeah.
I love dining in Fouquet's. I went to Fouquet's when I was in Paris to do my research and just pressed my nose against the window. I wasn't going in. They had very high taste, and Joyce had a habit of tipping.
Yeah.
But of course, Weaver got wind of this. Somebody mentioned in passing that Joyce was a great drinker, and she was appalled. She was a very straight-laced Protestant woman, and she wrote to him and said, oh, I hear that you're about the town spending loads of money or whatever. And he wrote back a very jokey letter, which was a modus operandi he had. oh, they say that I take cocaine, they say that I swim in the Seine every day. Don't believe everything you hear about me, you know? So, you know, and he had a habit of burning bridges, as you said, like he was persecuted. He had a persecution complex.
Yeah.
And he sort of burnt bridges a bit with both Weaver and Beach, but they both remained very loyal.
Yeah. In terms of Nora's relationship to his writing, in many ways it's there. We see Jim writing, but we get no insights into what it is he's writing. I've got to finish the novel, I'm doing the Penelope chapter and it's really tough and whatever. So it's in the background. What is her relationship to the writing from, not just even within the novel, but from your own sort of research, your own thoughts on that?
She protected his writing time, which is all that a writer needs. I think it was Alistair MacLeod who said, language, leisure and a place to sit, and money is built into the leisure, obviously. So she protected that time and made sure he got it done. She would drag him home from bistros early, knowing he had to write the next day. She would make sure the conditions were safe for his eyes so that he could see. In terms of the books itself, they say that she read, well, he used to say she's read 10 pages of Ulysses, including the cover, you know. She wasn't into modernist writing. He tried to get her to read various things and she didn't like them, and she wasn't afraid to say she didn't like them. She was her own person. She was sure of herself. She liked penny dreadfuls and she liked the Daily Mail. He introduced her to the pornographic writing of Sacher Masoch, for whom masochism is named. So they read a bit of porn together and enjoyed that. And yeah, she didn't get what he was trying to do as such, but she respected the fact that he did, and she respected the fact that other people should like it. So she was this weird, she could criticise him, but nobody else could, you know.
Yeah.
She liked Finnegan's Wake. She liked the musicality of it. Now there's a book, she said. She didn't like Penelope, that big fat Molly Bloom, she called her. As if being fat was a problem, but that, like in her eyes, that this was a character flaw, you know. What do you think of a book, Mr. Budgeon, she said, with a big fat married woman as its heroine? This was their friend, Frank Budgeon, the artist, you know. So she was kind of annoyed by Penelope, fearing, I suppose, that she was her. She was an amalgam, I suppose. Yes, I think she trusted that he knew what he was at.
And she was loyal to him. I think it's kind of known that she would talk about like his work being important and deserving the respect of readers and so on, even if she wasn't going to engage with it. In some
and annoyed with Ireland for not reviewing him well, for not publishing him, for letting him down. You know, he didn't get a lot of great reviews in his lifetime. A lot of the reviews of Ulysses were astonished at it, you know, and not in a good way.
Yeah.
Similarly, Dubliner's only got a handful of reviews. It just wasn't. Yeah.
I always get the sense that Ulysses in his lifetime, he was a writer's writer.
Yeah.
You know, that like F. Scott Fitzgerald loved him or whoever, but readers didn't know him.
Yeah.
You know.
And especially because the book was a private edition and then was banned in the States, and so people didn't have access to it.
Yeah.
And then they were smuggling it across the border, one copy at a time. A man used to get a ferry across with it down his trousers. Like, the thing was enormous, so it was kind of hard to smuggle. I mean, those women did so much for him, but he appreciated it. He was a great lover of and respecter of women, and he also respected and liked ordinary people, and therefore Nora, in a sense. He didn't marry, you know, one of the sheikhs who he was friends with. He married an ordinary woman. He liked nothing better than talking to waiters and doormen, and he didn't fit into that intellectual life in Paris, even though they moved there for it. Ezra Pound said, come here, you need to come here. It wasn't for him.
The family life, as it were. And that's what comes across, I think, here, doesn't it?
Yeah.
This is a story of a family.
Exactly, and when you read Joyce's letters to Giorgio, the later letters, they're so full of fun and love and joy about everything. They're jokey, they have a family language. You know, he writes about the wedding in a jokey way, the wedding that they sort of had to have because Giorgio wanted to get married and his wife wanted him to be legitimate getting married and all this sort of stuff. There was huge love between them, and it leaps off the pages of the letters especially, you know. And he was broken-hearted over Lucia.
Yeah. At the end of the novel, obviously when Joyce passes away, there's not much of a story left to tell, I suppose, of Nora. I mean, was she, in those later years, happy, sad?
It feels like a very melancholic period when you read it in the Maddox book. She had 10 years in Zurich by herself. Giorgio was there too, nearby. She used to go to a little vegetarian restaurant to eat because it was cheap. She was in very poor health with her arthritis. Lived in a little pension. She'd have some visitors from her grandson's family, Stephen's family, from the States, and he would come over and see her. He loved his nonna, as he called her. Yeah, it seems like an extended period of
Mourning.
loneliness and mourning, and she wanted to stay in Zurich because the Irish government wouldn't repatriate Joyce's body, and she was really pissed off with them, so she said, I'll stay here to be near him. And when she could, she'd get the tram up to Fluntern to the grave and say hello and put green leaves on it because he didn't like flowers. And
Those kind of things, yeah. I mean, it's a love story, really.
Yeah.
The two of them, Nora and Jim.
I have to say the subtitle was not my idea, and I was again it.
What's the subtitle?
The subtitle is A Love Story of Nora Barnacle and James Joyce. They wanted to shoehorn Joyce onto the cover somehow, so but I was like,
Yeah.
But then I've kind of grown, I've come around to it in the sense that I just worried when people saw love, they would think romance.
Yes.
You know, it's a love story in a real sense. It's about a lot of hardship and a lot of sticking together and a lot of, like, he was so reliant on her. You know, he literally was fainting when she went to Ireland on holidays and then got on a boat and came after her. He couldn't not be with her.
Yeah. I mean, I thought that was some of the, and they're comic when she goes to Ireland, or he goes to Ireland and he hears about this, that and the other. How dare you? And then she won't, I'm not talking to you, you know. So in those days, she sort of ghosts him.
Yeah.
You know, which even drives him more crazy. Because she's ignoring him and so on. It's got the kind of playfulness, and it's comic, but also the intensity.
Very intense.
Of their relationship. Yeah.
But sure, that's okay, isn't it? I think we're all a bit intense, aren't we? Well, I am anyway. You know, I think it's. I don't think it's fair to criticise them too much. They were of their time. They were who they were. I mean, there were plenty of men who drank and left their wives at home who didn't write works of staggering genius, so I think we'll forgive them.
Yes.
I do, anyway. I know a lot of people don't, but I do. I actually found, by the end of it, I found her an even more magnificent and impressive person.
Right.
And I found him, my empathy had grown hugely for him. Because in the past, I have to admit, I would have been critical of particularly his sponging. I was very sort of dismissive of that. It just annoyed me. It still annoys me, but I can see the whys and wherefores of it. I can see who supported him and why. And my empathy for him as an individual who suffered, because he really went through terrible things with his eyes and his stomach. So by the end of writing it and researching it, yes, my love for them has only grown.
Right, okay. And for it to become the One Dublin One Book, what was that? Is that a nice thing? Is that...
Yeah, well, you know it's going to do something that doesn't happen much, and that's... You're going to sell a lot. Yeah, and it got into the bestsellers list. This is my 16th book. I had never been in the bestsellers list. So that was fantastic. The project itself is like a month-long thing where the libraries encourage everyone in Dublin to read Nora, and there's a lot of events built around it. So there was 29 events. I was directly involved with 19 of those. It's a huge, huge, huge workload in terms of you physically being present, preparing for it, travelling. Like 2 of the events were abroad. One in London, one in Monaco. An absolutely fantastic opportunity, but utterly exhausting. And you literally don't write anything for months around it because you're preparing for it and everything. So for me anyway, and I won't speak for all writers, but all I want to be doing is at home writing. And while I love public events, and in and of themselves, every one of the events I did for that was fantastic.
Yeah.
I found it quite intense and stressful.
Yeah.
And when they asked for my feedback, I said that. I said, I do feel it's too much for one person,
Yeah.
you know.
I think it's a wonderful kind of opportunity because it kind of reminds me of when we were growing up and you'd watch a TV program, but everybody else was watching it because we'd only 3 channels or whatever.
Two.
Well, in Dublin we had whatever we had. I can't remember. We were robbing it from somewhere else, wherever. But like the idea that you're going to these events and so on, and a lot of people have read the same book, which is wonderful. It's a way of kind of sharing and a kind of conversation that you might not necessarily have, because it's like a book club on a large kind of scale, I suppose. But I think, it's kind of interesting, as you say, the intensity of that. But I think and also the fact that the book comes out just as the 100th year of Joyce's youth days and so on and so forth. So lots of serendipity there. Do you have any particular passage that you'd like to read for us?
Yeah, I'll read the first chapter. So they met first on the 10th of June and...
not the 16th?
No, they didn't end up walking out until the 16th because there was a bit of a miscommunication and she didn't turn up for the first date. Excuse me. Better get my specs on. So this chapter is called Muglins. Sorry. Dublin, June 16th, 1904. We walk along by the Liffey as far as Ring's End. The river smells like a piss pot spilling its muck to the sea. We stop by a wall, Jim in his sailor's cap looking like a Swede, me in my wide-brimmed straw, trying to throw the provinces off me. Out there are the Muglins rocks, Jim says, pointing out to sea. They have the shape of a woman lying on her back. His look to me is sly to see if I've taken his meaning. I have. And our 2 mouths crash together and it's all swollen tongues and drippy spit and our fronts pressed hard and a tight bunched feeling between my legs. His hands travel over my bodice and squeeze, making me gasp. Oh, Jim, is all I can manage to say, and I step away from him. You have no natural shame, Nora, he says. And he's coming at me now with his thing out of his trousers and in his hand, that one-eyed manine he's no doubt very fond of. It looks, I think, like a plum dressed in a snug coat. No natural shame, I say. Don't be annoying me. Do you think because I'm a woman that I should feel nothing, want nothing, know nothing? But I dip my nose to his neck for a second, the better to breathe his stale porter lemon soap smell. Span new to me. Lost my page. Jim squints and smiles. I kneel on the ground before him, my face before his tender manine. I glance up at him. Jim drops his head, the better to see my mouth close over it. The taste is of salt and heat. The feeling is thick and animal. I suck, but only for a spell. Then I draw back and peck the length of it with my lips. I stand up. There, I say. There's a kiss as shameful as Judas's. And don't tell me it isn't exactly what you wanted, James Joyce. A groan. He wants that bit more, of course. But that might be enough for today, our first time to walk out together. We kiss again, and he lingers in my mouth, wanting to enjoy the taste of himself on my tongue. His paws travel over me front and back. Oh, but he's relentless. So I unbutton him, put my hand into his drawers and wrap cool fingers around his heat. A gasp. I work him, slow, slow, fast, until he's pleasured, until my fist is warm and wet from him. You've made a man of me today, Nora, Jim says, a coddled whisper. And I smile. It's rare to have a fellow say such a thing, and I feel a small bit of power rise up through me, a small bit of joy. I wipe myself with my handkerchief, and Jim fixes his clothes. I hold out my hand, and Jim takes it, and together we walk on. Thank you.
A very powerful opening to the novel.
My agent was mildly alarmed at that.
Yeah.
She kept saying
What's gonna happen in
right until
chapter
the
2?
end. Yeah, she kept saying, "Are you sure you want to open with that?" And I was saying, "But it's historical fact. That's on the
That's
record." So
yes,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
But also in that opening, it's the voice of Nora that is compelling. I mean, we haven't talked about that, but this is first person. This is Nora telling her story, as it were.
yeah.
And I think is, well, I mean, it's obviously fiction in the sense that, like, you've read letters and so on and so forth, but you're imagining someone speak, I suppose, and you're trying to capture that. I mean, is that difficult? Is that working and reworking, or is it a zone you can get into and you're hearing this, or?
Yeah, it's more like a tone. So once I have the tone, I'm kind of off and ready. I mean, so I read her letters and the Molly Bloomish run-on sentences, the lack of punctuation, the sort of self-effacing. She'd slag herself in letters, you know, "Oh, sure, you know me, you know, I don't like walking much," or whatever it is she'd say. And so I had a kind of a tone for her. But obviously she has to sound, in one way, arch and knowing. And then when you listen to Molly Bloom and how she hops from topic to topic, and she doesn't care. One minute she'd be talking about her dead son, and the next minute she's talking about her lover, Blazes Boylan, or whatever. So I kind of wanted my Nora to sound a bit like Molly Bloom, but I didn't want to use any of Molly's language because I didn't want to, in a sense, steal from her. So, yeah, it's a sort of it's a patchworking thing, but once you get the sound of it, it flows. Like my first novel I wrote in the second person, and so many people said to me that must have been really hard, but it wasn't, because when you have it and it's there, when you come back to the desk, you just ease yourself back into it and you're off. It's a flow thing. So I didn't find it hard. I was robbing the vocabulary of my Galway friends, things like span new, it's not a phrase I'd say. Manine, the way they put the little diminutive on the end of everything. And then I made up the pet name Goosine that he calls her, and a few people were annoyed with me because they thought it was a real pet name, and then when they found out I'd made it up, they were kind of irritated. So, so all that stuff you're doing, you're just trying to create something that sounds real, but that couldn't possibly be real in a sense.
And have you found, I mean, in terms of people's reaction to the novel, did they want it to be real? If you know what I mean, are they? You say people are annoyed when they find out that Goosine you've invented that.
Yeah.
But did they think, you know, it's that kind of tension between fiction and history or documentary?
Yeah. So I did a book club the other day, and a woman's question to me was, "So tell us what's fact and what's fiction." So we're back to Hilary Mantel and the mayonnaise. It's like, sometimes I even forget. So I often have to go back in and refresh myself with the research just to make sure I'm not saying wrong things. Though you'll always make mistakes, so you can be forgiving. But I'd be surprised at things that I had used. So a lot of what Joyce says in the book is actually from his letters. Like I'm wedded to chronology, and I'm wedded to things being as right as I can possibly make them. So I didn't make up anything terribly untoward. So the chronology is correct, the things that happen. But as a fiction writer, my job is to embody these people, empathize with them, and create these probable, believable scenes. So when Giorgio comes home and says, "I'm with Helen Castor, and she's way older than him, she's married to someone else," the Joyces went bananas. You're making a show of us around Paris now. So I had to imagine that scene. What happened when this young 20-year-old comes home to tell his parents he's with a woman who's nearly twice his age, who's married? You know, so then you have to put yourself into the scene. So that's what you're doing. You know the facts, and then you create the scene.
Yeah, you're filling in the gaps, as it were, of history. Yeah. I mean, I think that's always, I mean, it's not the job of the fiction writer, but it's one of the joys of fiction. As in history, it's facts, it's dates, it's so on. It's all from the outside, perhaps, but what we get here is something from the inside, and it gives us a more intimate understanding, perhaps, of motivations of people, of characters. So just looking at the time, we're kind of coming up to the end, but any questions from the audience before we finish up? Yes, the back there.
I read your book and I love it.
Thank you.
At the end of the book, when Nora is on her own for the last 10 years, did you have any information, like letters or anything, that you could have fleshed out that those 10 years of it? I was kind of sad. It was all very sad at the end. You felt her life was... Was there stuff you couldn't use, or did she write to anybody?
She had a few visits that were recorded from various academics and people looking for Joyce stuff. There was the thing about the auction. They had to auction off a lot of his stuff to get money. So I had some stuff, but she had a very quiet life, so there has to be an element of drama in novels. And the drama was that Lucia was still in France. They were in Zurich, and they didn't see her. And then Giorgio forbid Nora to see her because she was in such a bad way, according to him. So there was that tension as well. But again, editorial steps in and says, you know, these are the bits that we're going to keep, and we can afford to get rid of that bit. And so there was other stuff in there, but, you know, yeah.
Any other questions yet over there on the left?
Thanks. I have three quick questions, if that's all right. And well done for choosing the piece to read that you did choose. Did you research much about institutions that people like Lucia ended up in, you know, at a time when, say, the word autism wasn't even known? Also, did you work towards the ending? Did you know the ending would always be that mystical or magical? At least that's how I experienced it, or supernatural even. And then my third question is, like, did you have any supernatural, or do you have supernatural experiences yourself in connecting with the women that you've written about, through synchronicities or dreams or anything like that?
First question, the research, yes. I mean, you have to, into treatments and stuff like that. Yeah, my theory is that she possibly was autistic or ADHD. But those things weren't known about or understood, or how they could affect person holistically and socially and all of the stuff that autism brings. The second question was... Oh, about halfway through a novel, I usually get my ending, and that's what happened with this. I circled it back. Joyce loved circularity in his own work, you know. If you think about the story, The Dead is called The Dead. The last two words are The Dead. Finnegan's Wake is a circle. MoLI's soliloquy is a circle. It's yes and yes, the two words bracketing. So I did the same thing. I brought them back to that piece that I just read there where they're holding hands. That's what happens at the end. And the idea of the goose on the wing and all of that, you know. Just, you know, imagining possibly my own death and hoping it's as peaceful as that, a feeling of being taken up or whatever. So yeah, normally I'm not a planner and the things happen organically. Obviously I'm using the facts of their life to map the thing out. But yeah, about halfway through or 3/4 of the way through, I usually know what the ending will be. And I work towards that. And the third question, synchronicities happen all the time when you're writing stuff, and I think your antennae are up, and so maybe that's why. But like, I remember going to Zurich to do research, and we were on one side of the road, and for some reason I crossed over, and there was graffiti on a wall that said Nora. You know, I just was drawn over to this wall for some weird reason. So all these kind of strange things happen. I can't think of any particular ones off the top of my head. Just all sorts of objects appearing in your... Like, when I was writing another one of my books, it was a contemporary novel called The Closet of Savage Mementos. In it, there was a central paperweight. And I went to my local charity shop, and the exact kind of paperweight I had in my head was sitting in the window for sale, and I bought it for €3. You know, this kind of weird stuff that happens. And I love that. And I think there is a sort of a tug of the universe around you when you're writing something like this. I certainly become a morning, noon and night person. I bring these people to the dinner table. Certainly my youngest child talks about Emily Dickinson and Jim as if we know them, as if they're, you know, because she often comes on the research trips with me too. So she's been in their houses or, wandered around Trieste looking at where they, eating in the cafes they ate in, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I tend to be very immersed.
Annie, yep.
Did you have any reaction from the extended Joyce family at all to the book?
No, Stephen Joyce, their last direct descendant, died in January 2020, and this came out in January 21. So I never actually got to speak to him about it. I know he'd have been annoyed about it anyway, because he was kind of annoyed about everything. But no, and I haven't met nobody has approached me. Funny, with the last book I wrote, the Belle Bilton one, I had some people approach me, a family of hers and family of other people in the book. And it was great because I got to talk with them and, learn more about the people I had written about. So that was brilliant. But, it's been peculiar silence. But I've had some Joyce scholars going bananas, but sure, you'd expect that.
They've little to be doing.
Mildly bananas.
Yes, yes.
I had that with the Emily Dickinson scholars too.
Oh, yes, of course, yeah. Okay, I think we're coming up to lunchtime. You get that feeling. So listen, this has been a wonderful, the way you're looking at your watch thinking, oh my goodness, will we get another 20 minutes out of it? We've gone over our time.
Thanks very much, Derek.
Very, very enjoyable talk about Nora. If you haven't read it, folks, please do. It is an excellent, excellent piece of writing. It's a super story. I know it is a love story between Nora Barnacle and James Joyce. But I think, as just talking over the last hour, it is about Nora, but it's about the family, it's about these other characters, and they're beautifully, beautifully drawn. And even though we know it's about James Joyce, I think it's just a good story as well. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Derek.